Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about Last Night in Soho, a film that I have very complicated feelings about. I first want to acknowledge that it's a beautiful film with incredible cinematography. The performances are just amazing, and the soundtrack, I pretty much listen to it on a daily basis. But it also deals with very sensitive topics, and it triggered a very strong emotional response when I watched it for the first time. In fact, it hit so close to home that I was honestly unable to view it through my usually pretty sharp critical lenses, which was like a first for me. So, because I felt such a strong connection to the film, it immediately became one of my favorite movies of all time. It spoke to me on a deeply personal level. I watched it like 6 times without having any real critical opinion about it. I just knew that I felt something incredibly strong when I watched it. Close to unbearable, actually. And because I rarely experienced such an intense reaction to a piece of media, I didn't really question it. So the reason I'm making this video is because I ended up watching it with my twin not too long ago, and I will credit her for literally everything interesting I have to say about it, because to be honest, she quite literally had to spell everything out for me. Because she had that distance that I lacked, and also because her critical lenses are perhaps slightly sharper than mine, how humbling, I know, she was able to be like, this is kind of problematic. And though I understand why this film feels so important to you, I don't think it's good for you. Kind of like when you're really into someone and the infatuation is so powerful you're completely blind to the massive red flags. And then you introduce them to your friends and they're like,
Oh, honey.
so yeah, I had like a 3 hour long discussion with my twin after watching it, and I realized just how difficult it is to be objective when you're emotionally overwhelmed, especially when there's a lot of projection going on. And realizing the extent to which this film failed me as a sexual assault survivor, and how much I was able to love it despite and even paradoxically because of its failures in this regard. It was just a very enlightening experience. And I wanted to share the thoughts that it has awakened in me, so stick around if you want to hear them, I guess. And Rachel, Twinny, if you're watching this, you already heard all of it, but thank you for your valuable insights which have inspired this entire video. As usual, before we get started, spoiler alert, I'm going to discuss the film in details and spoil the entire thing. So, if you want to watch this movie, obviously don't watch this video just yet. Also, like in every video I make, trigger warning, I'm going to be discussing very sensitive topics such as suicide, sexual assault, and prostitution. I'm not going to go into graphic details, but do feel free to click off this video if hearing about any of these things might make you feel some type of way. Before I get to my first impressions and my newfound thoughts on the film, I want to go through the entire story because it's really important to how I feel about it. So if you've watched the film already and don't want to hear all about the details of the plot, feel free to skip to this point of the video. Last Night in Soho is a 2021 British psychological horror film that tells the story of Eloise Turner, or Ellie, a young woman obsessed with the music and fashion of the 60s. Already carrying a great deal of trauma with her, with her mother committing suicide when she was 7, Ellie is a very fragile character. This is made obvious to the audience through her grandmother's apparent concern as she moves from her rural home to the city to study at the London College of Fashion. In the opening sequence, we are made aware that Ellie is able to see her dead mother, and this sort of indicates that maybe she's able to see ghosts or that she has some unresolved psychological issues. After moving to the city, Ellie very much struggles to fit in with her peers. Her roommate Augusta is pretty much Regina George 2.0, and she throws parties and has sex in the same room as her, without any regard to how that may make her feel. And this is all very overwhelming for our protagonist. So she decides to move into a bedsit owned by an elderly woman called Mrs. Collins. The first night she sleeps in her new room, Ellie dreams that she is transported back to the 1960s, at a club called the Café de Paris. She watches in awe as the captivating blonde woman, Sandy, sets to become a famous singer. Sandy makes an impression on Jack, a charming manager with whom she shares a passionate kiss before he takes her home, back to the room which Eloise currently occupies. The next morning, inspired by Sandy, Ellie draws the dress she was wearing in her dream, and even uses one of Sandy's lines on her classmate, Dawn, who kind of seems to be into her. She also discovers a love bite on her neck, which indicates that what happened the night before couldn't all have been a dream, but is weirdly unbothered by that. In fact, she is very eager to get back to bed and see what Sandy will do next. In her second dream, Jack surprises Sandy by setting up an audition at a nightclub, and she absolutely kills it. Jack and Sandy then have sex and he promises to be with her till the very end. Feeling increasingly drawn to Sandy, Ellie dyes her hair blonde and buys very expensive clothes to match her fashion style. She also gets a job at a local pub to cover the expenses. An old man who had been observing her notices her similarities to Sandy and makes creepy cryptic comments. Ellie also starts noticing certain aspects of buildings in Soho that match what he saw in her dreams, which indicates that they may actually be visions of the past rather than pure fantasies. Despite how strange this all is, Ellie is still very excited to fall asleep and pursue her dream alter ego double life. Feeling empowered by Sandy's confidence and charm, she is very eager to watch her inevitable rise to stardom. Ellie goes to bed and her horror matches that of the audience as she discovers that Sandy's life is far from what she had expected. Indeed, she stares helplessly as the beautiful Sandy is forced into prostitution by Jack, who, as it turns out, is more of a pimp than an actual manager, using young women's dreams of fame to lure them in and then sexually exploit them. After this turning point, the dream quickly becomes a nightmare. Ellie's visions grow more and more disturbing, and she can no longer escape them, even when she is awake. Ellie is now literally being haunted by troubling apparitions, ghost-like visions of Jack and of the numerous men who force themselves on Sandy. As a result, she now tries to avoid sleep at all cost. Her classmate John invites her to a Halloween party, and seeing this as a way to stay awake, she jumps on the offer. At the party, it is implied that Ellie may have been drugged by her former roommate, but it's never really made clear. She takes John back to her apartment, despite it violating Mrs. Collins' rules of no boys in the house, and they start fooling around in her bed. As things become more intimate, Eloise has a vision of Jack murdering Sandy. She panics and starts screaming, and Mrs. Collins is very unhappy with her. Jack runs out of the room, and in the ensuing chaos, a mirror is broken. A symbol of bad luck, but also of split identity. Ellie becomes convinced that the older man who has been following her is in fact an older version of Jack, and that Sandy's murder really took place in the past. She goes to the police, but unsurprisingly they are very dismissive and suggest that she might have mental or drug-related issues. Set on solving this murder, she tries to find evidence of Sandy's death, but instead discovers newspaper articles of local men who went missing in the 60s. In a desperate attempt to get justice for Sandy, Ellie tries to get the older man, whom she believes to be Jack, to confess, but he denies all of it, claiming instead that Alex, the nickname Sandy took on as a prostitute, killed Sandy. As he leaves the pub, the man is hit by a car and dies instantly. Ellie's boss reveals that his name was actually Lindsay, not Jack. She recalls seeing him in one of her visions and discovers that he was an undercover cop who tried to get Sandy out of her unfortunate situation, but found it was already too late for her. Lost and confused, Ellie realizes that she has to leave London and goes to Mrs. Collins to inform her of her decision. Then we get to the twist, as it is revealed that Mrs. Collins is actually Sandy. See, in her vision, Ellie thought that she saw her die, but it was actually Sandy who killed Jack in self-defense as he attacked her with a knife. So, after killing the man responsible for everything that went wrong in her life, Mrs. Collins confesses to Ellie that she lured the men whom Jack had forced her to have sex with and killed them one by one, then proceeded to hide their bodies in the house floorboards and walls. I get that this is a movie and that suspension of disbelief is demanded, but you're asking me to believe that instead of running away or just going to the police or just hiding this one body, she decided to keep being a prostitute, despite the fact that, Jack wasn't there to force her anymore, and seduce all these men before murdering them night after night, then take apart the foundations of her house to hide the bodies, and kept it up long enough to kill at least 20 men, and smell was never an issue. Also, did she destroy her floor and walls after each killing and then rebuild them after every murder only to do it all over again the next night? I mean, that seems like a lot of effort. And sure, it may seem a bit nitpicky to call out the practical aspect of things, but the movie was pretty much grounded in reality until now. Sure, the reality of an unstable, psychologically disturbed individual, but even in a movie that deals with ghosts and apparitions, the horror works because of how the supernatural aspects contrast with the more realistic ones. It's just such a big jump, it ends up feeling like a different movie. It's like going from Shutter Island to Sweeney Todd in a total of 5 minutes. It doesn't really work. Anyhow, finding out that Ellie went to the police apparently triggered Mrs. Collins' murderous instincts, and she now wants to kill her to make sure she won't tell anyone what she did. Even though, Ellie had no idea what she did until she confessed. So she basically becomes a villain stereotype who reveals her plot to the hero because they're gonna die anyway, so who cares? And we're now supposed to believe that Sandy, who was never portrayed as something other than an ambitious young woman who's been abused and hurt, is fine with killing an innocent girl. After discovering that Mrs. Collins poisoned her tea, Ellie knocks over an ashtray and the house catches on fire. John, who was waiting in the car, comes to help Ellie but is stabbed by Mrs. Collins, who then chases after Ellie into her bedroom, where the ghosts of Sandy's victims beg her to avenge them and kill Sandy, but Ellie refuses. Sandy snaps out of her murderous episode as she too now sees the ghosts and is confronted to the horror of what she's done. Not just the killings, but passing that trauma onto Ellie. She tells her that she didn't want any of this and that they deserved it, to which Ellie says, "I know." The sounds of siren brings them back to reality, and Sandy tries to slit her own throat to escape the police, but Ellie stops her. Sandy tells Ellie to save herself, but that she can't go to prison, and chooses to remain in the building as it burns, and all her ghosts with it, while Ellie and John manage to escape. Skip into a few months later, and Ellie successfully completed her year at school and designed an entire collection that brings out elements of the fashion inspired by Sandy, with more futuristic influences. Which implies that while she embraces the impact this whole incident had on her, she is moving on. She has dyed her hair back to her natural color, indicating that she is no longer trying to resemble Sandy and is ready to be herself again. In a shot that echoes the beginning of the movie, Ellie sees her mother smiling at her and knows that she is proud of her. Her grandmother congratulates her and all is well, but then she sees Sandy's reflection in a mirror, who blows her a kiss. The end. So I want to start by talking about what I like about this movie. It explores themes that are very much linked to femininity and the female experience. It delves into the horror of sexual violence against women, as well as the dual image through which women are perceived. Eloise and Sandy serving as opposite doubles, with the dangerous sexual woman on the one hand and the pure, innocent, childlike virgin character on the other. The recurring theme of broken mirrors also reinforces this idea of split identity that women are forced to perform, severing different aspects of themselves into two distinct entities, a phenomenon I refer to as the Madonna whore split. And I think for a second there, the film really seems to subvert the whole demonization of female sexuality that prevailed in popular media for so long. Indeed, Sandy is confident, fierce, and always gets what she wants, and these traits are very much idealized by the more shy and withdrawn Eloise. In fact, she feels empowered and attracted to Sandy, rather than jealous or envious. And throughout the majority of the film, we see this typical angel-like female character not being threatened or judgmental of Sandy, but rather being inspired by her and feeling protective of her, which I thought was an amazing subversion of the original trope. I also think that the film is successful in its use of horror to depict the sexual violence women are subjected to. The scenes in which Eloise is forced to watch Sandy being abused are terrifying, and the film doesn't glorify or romanticizes men's unrestrained and invasive behaviors. Rather, they can only be interpreted as clear denunciations. Something else that I liked is that Ellie is studying fashion, something usually portrayed as a feminine interest, and usually viewed as trivial because of that. But here is shown as an ambitious and fascinating career path. So it's like through a majority of the film we have themes that are about women, for women, and they are portrayed in an authentic and respectful way. And I think that's why, at first glance, it's easy to see it as a progressive feminist film. It denounces violence against women and glorifies feminine solidarity, as well as the two typical expressions of femininity, and unlike most popular media, it doesn't condemn one while putting the other on a pedestal. Until we get to the twist. Because everything this film had been building towards was really empowering and subversive in terms of how it explored female identity and denounced the violence and horror of the female experience, we expect a certain catharsis from the climax. Something that will feel validating for perhaps the women who can identify with the characters on screen. After all, isn't that who the film is directly speaking to when addressing such matters? So what does the final act do? What message does it convey to the audience who, if the movie did its job right, had been identifying with both of our female protagonists? Well, it kind of stabs them in the back. Because of the big twist, Mrs. Collins being Sandy and Sandy becoming the final villain of the story, all this subversion, all this transgression of traditional norms end up being reinforced. And it is such a letdown. Because again, we were building toward a catharsis around the denunciation of sexual violence and the exploitation of women, of reconciling the socially constructed duality of female identity. And because of the twist, we end up with the exact opposite. We had a subversion of the sexual, dangerous woman by portraying Sandy as a clear and undeniable victim of Jack, despite being sensual and ambitious. Well, turns out Sandy is this evil old woman who lured and killed dozens of men and wants to add an innocent girl to her list of victims. We have the terrifying depictions of men inflicting violence on women, literally portrayed as faceless ghosts who grab at Ellie and threaten her safety. Turns out they were just Sandy's victims crying out to our protagonist for help. We had an innocent ingenue who actually had something to learn from a more sexual embodiment of femininity. Well, turns out it was just a cautionary tale about the dangers such a life entails. I don't know about you guys, but the movie I had been watching didn't really make any of these twists emotionally satisfying. In fact, the twist that would have been satisfying and coherent with the themes explored by the rest of the film would have been to reveal that Mrs. Collins is indeed Sandy, and that despite being forced into sex work and being the victim of abuse and violence, she managed to survive and grow old. That would have been a subversion of pervasive regressive tropes around femininity that I would have been very excited to watch. And considering the rest of the movie, that's the sort of cathartic climax I would have been expecting. 'Cause surely a film that is about women, for women, and denounces the violence and harassment we go through on a daily basis, surely that kind of film would have a healing, progressive message for that specific portion of its audience. Right? Well, and this is why horror as a genre occupies a very weird place in my heart. As Elizabeth Bronfen points out, horror often expresses cultural anxieties, acting as a form of cathartic entertainment, delving into what is repressed by society. Hence, it often presents itself as an inquiry into our darkest, forgotten, and best left unspoken fears, enabling the audience to project and exercise them into a fictional fantasy, exposing us to their threatening nature while keeping us at a safe distance. Yet, despite its exploration of societal taboos, the message it conveys is often revealed to be rather conservative. What I mean is that the fictions it produces are often resolved in a restoration of the status quo, in a return to the natural order of things, which expels the transgression that had drawn the audience interest in the first place. It was very disappointing to realize that, like many horror films, Last Night in Soho ultimately condemns the transgression it sublimes. And while it capitalizes on our interest around it, it never truly encourages us to embrace it. While it flirts with the subversion of incredibly damaging tropes, it ends up reinforcing them. Though until we get to the twist, the film seems firmly opposed to it, we end up with the same vilification of female ambition and sexuality, a cautionary tale that serves as a warning to women about the inherent dangers they present. The twist literally undoes and undermines all its previous achievements. Sandy is not the victim, she is the villain, and there are no real explanations for that. We are already conditioned to view female sexuality as inherently villainous, and hence we accept this nonsensical reveal with no resistance at all. Now, despite this twist counting on the audience's preconceptions and internalized misogynist beliefs, I will acknowledge that the film does not completely and utterly vilify Sandy. We are still encouraged to sympathize with her, but we must accept that she is at least partly evil and must die. The visual of an older Sandy trying to kill Ellie plays on the duality of womanhood, first explored by the film. Only the previous message of female solidarity is overpowered by this inevitable rivalry. While Eloise tries to save Sandy, in the end the two cannot coexist. The whore must die in order for the more pure, virginal girl to live. And while Sandy's death had already been established before the twist, her first death was presented as a terrible injustice that had to be answered for, not as an inevitability that feels almost like a rightful punishment. At the end, Sandy is trapped into a mirror, only allowed to exist as a fantasy, or as a reminder of how dangerous sexuality and ambition is for women. She can empower more traditionally conservative female characters by winking at them, but is too dangerous to exist freely as anything other than a fantasy that must be contained. By having her commit suicide, the narrative underlines that, while captivating and entrancing, Sandy must ultimately be destroyed. She should not be copied or imitated. That message is reinforced by Ellie changing her hair back to her natural color, no longer trying to embody Sandy, for she has learned a lesson. It would have been so refreshing to see a rape survivor who, actually survives. The depiction of people who have been assaulted and commit suicide is almost a cliche at this point in popular media. And knowing that a majority of women experience some form of sexual assault throughout their lives, this is a very harmful message to internalize. The idea that once you go through something like that, you are ruined and too damaged to survive is a complete myth. But unfortunately, it's really hard to unlearn. And this movie had the perfect opportunity to subvert it, but instead it did the exact opposite. In the end, Sandy's past catches up to her. She did survive, but only for so long, before she too becomes a ghost, restored to her former youth and beauty in a final act that, instead of letting her be a survivor, vilifies her, incinerates her on the very bed on which she was violated, and buries her with the ghost that raped her. I mean, is it outrageous to find this offensive? And you might think, okay, this isn't a feminist landmark. It doesn't subvert the Madonna whore dichotomy. In fact, it plays right into it. But so what? What's the harm in exploiting an overly exploited trope as just a movie? What's the harm? Now that I've kind of explained why the film is disappointing in terms of everything it failed to achieve from a feminist perspective, I want to explain why it disappointed me on a more personal level. Watching this film for the first time hurt, because I identified with both Sandy and Ellie. They both resonated with me, with different sides of me. Ellie reminded me of the person I used to be when I first got to the city and started my own studies, before a lot of traumatic experiences with men shaped and changed me. And Sandy, well, she reminded me of both who I was before and who I became after that. After I trusted the wrong men, after life happened to me. I connected with this film specifically because it encouraged me to reject the Madonna whore dichotomy. Because its denunciation of violence against women encouraged me to expect something healing rather than damaging from it. Seeing it for the first time, I was literally crying in the cinema. Because I felt like it reinforced something that I unfortunately always believed. That the Sandy side of myself was inherently wrong. And that the good girl, Eloise side of me, was the only part of myself that deserved to live. And what sucks even more is that I just accepted it. I came out of the theater thinking that the movie was right, because this message had already been so ingrained in me. I already had so much internalized shame about the bad girl, sexual side of me. I didn't need any convincing. It felt painful, but true. And I hate that even after watching the film multiple times, I wasn't able to stand up for Sandy, and by extension, myself. When Ellie tries to get the old man, whom she believes to be Jack, to confess to Sandy's murder, he tells her, "I think you'll find that Alex killed Sandy." And at no point does the movie question that. The film encourages the audience to believe that, in the end, Sandy's story is one of self-destruction. But it isn't. I mean, have we all been watching the same movie? She didn't do this to herself. So why the hell are we compelled to believe that? She was forced into prostitution. And the film rightfully depicts her as a victim. That is, until she starts fighting back. Because the second she does that, she becomes evil. Like killing her abuser in self-defense turns her into a calculating murderer, a horror movie slasher, a vengeful seductress, the whore who killed the girl that she once was. What hurts me even more than the film's harmful message is how easy it was for me to believe it. No matter how much it hurt and how unfair it felt. I was like, yeah, of course. Of course I deserved it. Of course I did this to myself. Of course these men are evil and deserve to die. But so do I. There is no coming back once a Madonna becomes a whore. It is the turning point of womanhood, after which I suppose one must bear children and desexualize oneself, or remain a whore and die a violent death. It's sad, because so much of this film resonates with me, so much about it captures the female experience so well, and it hurts even more to be slapped in the face with a message like this at the end. By making Sandy the villain and killing her off, they take away anything about the story that could have been healing for survivors. Having Sandy survive and turn into this nice old lady who just happened to be beautiful and ambitious and experience horrible sexual traumas. The real twist would have been to have her survive them and just allow her to get old and live a normal life. But no, instead we got the evil femme fatale, the murderous seductress, the villain. No explanation needed. Again, this trope is so pervasive, it almost feels natural to believe in. One of the lines that made me cry the hardest in this entire film is when Mrs. Collins tells Eloise that someone did die in that room. The younger me died in that room. I died 100 times. I related to that feeling so much. Being abused so many times. Enduring what it's like to be a woman in a world that objectifies us and blames us for the abuse that it puts us through. To then have Sandy become evil before our very eyes. Just to then passively accept her fate, embracing death as her only possible outcome. That hurts in a way there are frankly no words for. The movie is explicitly saying that Sandy cannot survive. That Ellie must outlive her, because even though she flirted with the idea, Ellie hasn't been ruined. She can carry on living. Sandy cannot. Sandy tries to kill Eloise, but fails. And Eloise tries to save Sandy, but fails. And the established order that condemns female sexuality is restored. The deadly flames spare Ellie and purify Sandy. As though she can only be made pure again, good again, through death. As though fire only can purge her from her sins. Burn the witch, am I right? When we first see Sandy die in Ellie's dream, the vision is one of horror, straight out from a nightmare. But her final death is the climax of the story. A cathartic purge that feels peaceful. Sandy is no longer fighting back. It is the natural order of things, and it feels tragic, but right. And then she becomes nothing but a fantasy again. She can no longer invade or intrude, nor create chaos. She has gone up in flames, now trapped into the mirror, the reflection of a more virtuous girl. Status quo has been restored in yet another victory of good over evil. And this pisses me off. Because none of it is fair. Because Alex didn't kill Sandy. Because the entire narrative encourages us to believe that she indeed made her bad. And it could have done so much more than framing Eloise as the final girl, the one who deserves to live, the one who remained pure and virginal. I find it worth mentioning that the only time Ellie tries to have sexual intercourse, she literally sees Sandy, her opposite and double, a part of herself, being violently killed. And I cannot help but interpret this as a cautionary tale. While it explores the horror women endure, and while it sublimes, for a time, the transgressive beauty of female sexuality, in the end it is vilified and punished. The moral of the story is basically telling young women, stay yourself, stay pure, and you won't be subjected to the horrors of male desire. And also, don't awaken your evil sexual double, or it will consume you and kill you. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about this movie, not because I think it's a bad film. I do believe that it's an incredible piece of art, but I just want to share my impressions because I think in the end, while the movie resonated with me by exploring traumas that I related to, it failed to add any healing that should have come with that. And maybe that's why I loved it so much. Both despite and because of how much it hurt. It kind of echoed my own internalized self-loathing. And I guess the masochist side of me thought it felt good to have those beliefs reinforced. But Having watched this film with someone who loves me, both the good girl and the bad girl side of me, it helped me realize that both Eloise and Sandy deserve to overcome their traumas and live. It doesn't matter if you're a good girl or a bad girl. You don't need to kill a part of yourself in order to survive. You both get to live, and fuck anyone who says otherwise. So, in conclusion, I think I'm going to end this by saying that while the movie was very close to accomplishing something groundbreaking, it ended up pushing a message that very much should have died in the 60s. If you're still here, well done, you have made it to the end of this video. I am so grateful. Seriously, thank you so much. And whether you identify with Ellie or Sandy or neither or both, you are awesome and beautiful and you do not deserve to be set on fire. So on this note, I hope you have a great rest of your day and bye.